Ashish, thank you so much for joining us. Congratulations, first of all, on being the recently minted unicorn. I've had the privilege of actually seeing how off business operates from the inside, seeing you operate from the inside since I've worked there. And not a lot of people know, but the podcast actually is because of the stint that I had with off business, and the fact that I got to see both profitable business while being at off business because it was profitable back then too, and also interacting with so many SMEs that had built profitable business, and that's how the podcast came about. But let's start at the very beginning, right? You've had a stellar career. You were at ITC, McKinsey, every sort of classic sort of institution that you want on your resume. You had it all, and then you gave it all up and said, "I want to become an entrepreneur now." Very few people go from that venture capitalist to operator route. What made you choose that route?
Firstly, thank you for having me, Siddharth, and congrats goes to you as well. With one of our key off-business mottos being the fact that once an OEBN, forever one. So, thank you for your contributions during your stint, and look forward to the journey ahead. Thank you for having me on this chat, and I'm looking forward to this conversation as well. So, in my mind, to be very honest, it was a very natural jump because I'll tell you what happened. I was in the VC world looking at a lot of startups, and sometime I would say late 2014, early 2015, I started seeing a lot of action in the B2B space. I started seeing procurement companies being formed. I started seeing logistics companies being formed, financing companies being formed, and I said, okay, hey, this is the world that I come from. In the fact that I had run a SME, traded between a few SMEs, invested in a few SMEs, where also I also had a very operating role. And I said, okay, this is the world that I come from. This is seeing an exodus of good talent, and I said, this is where I belong, and let me jump. I think that was one big thing. And the second thing that always used to rankle in my mind when I was a consultant is that probably I had all the job to do the analysis, but never had the results under my control. Investing was probably one step ahead of that in the sense that we were putting our money where our mouth is, but again, we did not have the result in our control. But I think that thing really rankled in my head, and I wanted my destiny to be in my own hands than in somebody else's. So I would say these two combined together, the first a more micro thought of what I saw, and second a more feeling that was always in my head is made me jump. Took me a while to jump. Took me about a year to come out of Matrix with all the operating roles that I had. I was not really a standard venture capitalist who was doing the armchair thinking and selecting the right asset. My model was very simple that whichever portfolio company I was involved with, I used to go and tell them, hey, give me an operating role, whatever it be, a department or a region to handle, and give me a good valuation on entry. So beyond a point, it was not scalable too. But it took me a while to come out, and I think 2015 end is when I made the jump finally.
2015 and 2016, as you said, the B2B world was starting to see a lot of action. You had personally sort of gone into B2B commerce, right? That was the broad theme that you said, I'll figure something out in B2B commerce. You go in, and the first 2, 3, 4 months, because of the stellar team that you put in place, your GMV is through the roof, right? I was reading somewhere that you were the fastest in terms of the quarterly GMV from start to that scale, right? But taking a step back at that point in time when everything looked good from the outside and saying, hey, something was amiss and financing needs to be a part of this. Take me through that journey of like commerce and financing doing that together.
Yeah. So I think commerce came very naturally to us. I think all the founding team members had commerce in their blood because they probably had seen it in their family businesses, or they even got exposed to those businesses early on in their life. So commerce was an easy thing to start off with. When we started commerce, we quickly realized, I would say in the first month or two, that the reason the customer was choosing us, at least the foot in the door, was because of the fact that we had good credit terms, which was probably better in terms of both commercial terms as well as the tenure that we were offering. And that was a good foot in the door. And that is because of which the customer was actually choosing us. And we said, okay, if that is the reason, this is money that I don't want to really be funding out of my own balance sheet because it is risky. So the first thing that we did in the first couple of months is actually we said, okay, let's run a financing marketplace, and we got a few large banks and a few large NBFCs, in fact, a few startup NBFCs also to do it. And we realized that this is just not going to scale. The reason it's not going to scale is because the financing companies were up to their own agenda, which is to do full underwriting after we've done our underwriting. So it made the process operationally extremely complex. And second of all, the complexity was actually leading to a lead time by which time the order was lost. So we said, okay, while we were significantly scaled up, I mean, just to put down into numbers, I think in about 4 months we were doing probably 18 to 20 crores a month, which during that time was actually pretty high, especially since you just started, right? We said, okay, this is not going to be a healthy business. At some point in time, it is going to hit a glass ceiling. So why not just change the operating model right away and start doing financing on our own? So it was more by, we would have anyways done financing probably a year to two out, but I think it was more fast forwarded with the experience that we had in the first 3-4 months.
Got it. When you say B2B commerce, when you started out, and I know this because I've heard some of the initial journeys, right? There were multiple sort of iterations that happened within it, trying to target the construction segment, trying to target some other segments. How did you go through that iteration process? What were you looking for when you said, okay, this works versus let's not do this, let's move on to something else?
So I have a very simple funda of life when it comes to running a business, and whenever I've dabbled in business, I've always used that particular funda. So one funda that I always use is that it has to be profitable right from the outset at a transaction level. And I do not believe in the fact that 90% of your transaction should be profitable. Every single transaction has to be profitable, right? The second funda that I have is that businesses have to grow through debt. And the third funda that I have is that you will have to not spend too much money in marketing, but spend a lot more money in sales. Because in India, return on marketing is difficult to compute, whereas return on sales is typically very high. So what happened is, because of these three things, we tried, and we knew that whatever commerce we tried has to be true to all three facets. So initially when we began, we started across 3 or 4 domains. We started across consumables, in which we missed the profitable point, because there were close to about 10 to 15% transactions which were individually not in profit, because there used to be returns, the transaction sizes were small and stuff like that. Then we also tried out a little bit of services. On the services side, what was happening is that the sales cycle was so long that fundamentally the debt was not finding it very attractive, meaning that there always used to be a gap before you actually saw revenue. And because of that, the P&L always used to be in a hole. And the third thing that we tried at that time, which again did not scale very well, was actually to start off saying that we will do things in a marketplace, wherein we just connect the buyer and the seller and make a marketplace neat transaction in between. But reality there was that repeat transactions were not happening, and hence it would have not led to profitability. So while we started everything together, some things scaled better. I think the larger ticket size transactions of bulky goods which used to be transported in full truckloads and used to be ordered in large transaction sizes actually became a business which was true to all the 3 points that I told you, and that is what we ended up scaling. But to be honest with you, it was a period wherein there was a lot of push and pull. All the businesses, though, while they were not meeting the 3 points, were scaling up quite decently, and I would say it was kudos to everybody who was involved in those businesses which we did not end up scaling, to actually take the poison pill and stop those businesses. So one of the good things about our business has always been that if we don't believe in the business, even if it looks good right now, we've always stopped it immediately. We failed fast so that we can, whenever we succeed big. So our first success was actually in the bulkiest metal possible, which is very non-intuitive, non-glamorous, unsexy to the real world, which is steel, right? Which is as bulky as it gets, as profitable as it gets, as large as it gets in terms of transaction size. And that's how we made the choice. With those 3, I would say, guiding principles.
When you say consumables, what kind of products are these?
These would be things like safety shoes, these would be welding rods, these would be, long tail consumables that typically a manufacturing or an infrastructure contractor setup would use, but things that would not be on their radar when they are buying it, because it's probably something that is very low in terms of cost, but is probably not available that way. And globally, billion-dollar companies like Grainger and Fastenal have been built out of. And at that point in time, there were, I remember, at least 4 or 5 startups that had started along with us, which were attempting to do that, which with varying degrees of success. There was Industry Buying, there was Tolexo, there was Bulk MRO. The only company I think which actually scaled that up to an extent is Mooglinks.
Yeah, 100%. When you talk about these three factors, specifically the profitability angle, right, one of the things that you can't potentially do is go out and create a new market, because creating a new market generally involves a lot more marketing dollars, a lot more on sort of unit economics, forgetting about the unit economics and hoping that the market is going to be big enough. So you obviously have to go after an existing market, and steel perfectly fits that criteria. But when you go after an existing market, what also happens is that value chain is fairly established, right? There are, large manufacturers, there are secondary manufacturers, and there are distributors, and they are selling to the various companies. It's not like steel is a new thing that people want, right? So how do you go out and disrupt an existing fairly stable value chain, right?
Yeah. So there is an element of strategy into it, but there is an element of execution to it. And both are equally important. It initially seems like strategy is more important, but you soon figure out that the latter is actually more important than the former. The strategy part of it was fairly straightforward in trading of steel when we had started, and then we've now taken steel into close to about 19 or 20 other product categories, which we dominate today. But what we saw in steel is actually true for everything else, which is that the supply chain was always very layered, which means that every person in the supply chain, whether or not they were adding value to the supply chain, they were keeping a margin for themselves, which was a composition of both financing and the trade margin that they were keeping for themselves. Right? So both put together, there was a clear disintermediation possibility. If you could, in your own wherewithal, go and tie up with the OEM or the raw material manufacturer and trade it straight to the consumer by actually passing out or disintermediating the layers in between, you could earn a healthy margin for yourself. So that was the very basic strategy with which we had started. Then we added layers to it by saying that, okay, let's strip out financing, take it to a NBFC. Then NBFCs can actually give you a lower interest margin. You don't have to do it on your own balance sheet. That actually became the second layer of innovation. But at a very simplistic level, it was disintermediation, aggregation, and giving, and hence getting volume discounts, passing some of it to the customer and keeping some for yourself. And the customer has to be the end consumer of goods and not really an intermediary in between. So that's how we started. That was the basic strategy, but the execution part of it was the real tough one, which I think we got right in a few months, because we soon realized that the execution had four elements to it. The first element was that most of these ventures that were actually end users of steel or end consumers of steel were typically there in city peripheries. Okay, so there was this travel element that you had to do, and people had to sacrifice their quality of lives to actually go there. So that was one. The way we solved for it is that we said, okay, our sales team is largely going to be freshers. If you remember your time at Off Business, we had this MT program which began then. The MTs were typically guys in their first job, and they would go wholeheartedly to actually build something which they can call their own. The second issue that we had to solve for in execution was to say that, hey, you know what? We had to cold call to actually reach out to this customer. Now, if you cold call, you are building a very unscalable enterprise, which means that the cost of sales is going to be very, very high. So what we did is that we built a system wherein we said that we will actually do a marketing service like Bid Assist, which is a tender aggregation engine that actually aggregates tenders and makes it available for the customers. The customers will come and see the tenders that are relevant for them. And when they come, we will find out their relevant details and start calling them upon. And then Off Business per se is not really a new service for them, right? So through that, we actually solved the problem of saying, hey, we do not want to do a cold call, but we will rather get introduced through a warm intro. The third problem was to make sure that how do you really build a sales engine, because now you've solved for the sales personnel on the ground, but then they have to talk to each other. They have to build camaraderie amongst each other. They have to work like an army, and in an army, the biggest thing is discipline, performance, brotherhood, and stuff like that. The way we did that is that we did it through apprenticeship, which is to say, people like you would remember, you were a senior manager, so was I. So was almost everybody when you were there. We all used to be on the field. So by apprenticeship, by actually seeing seniors being on the field themselves, these people were always enthused to always be on the ground, right? So that was third, and we had some minor innovations, cultural innovations, parties, outtakes to make it look like an extension of college and stuff like that. Made sure that we had that elements of brotherhood and camaraderie actually built in. The fourth thing that we had to really push for was in terms of getting the output out of this, which is to make sure that it was not just a brotherhood oriented system, but a really meritocratic one. And because of that, people were being judged because of what they brought onto as output and numbers rather than what they had as experience. So through that, we actually created a system to say, hey, you know what? We are going to make sure that your performance is measured, and your performance is what takes you far in the system rather than anything else, right? So I think in combination of these four things is how we executed the initial, I would say, success is a wrong and abused word, so but our initial penetration into the market.
And very well put, by the way. I think I've seen all of those four things in action, but for listeners, it takes years to get individually these things right. When you bid assist came way later, this whole MT program came way later, but the broader vision was always to do something on these elements to get the execution right. And that's something that I personally learned while being at off business. The
And you were
execution,
responsible for it.
yeah, partly, but the execution machine across different departments was just phenomenal, right? In terms of processes, in terms of usage of tech, in terms of the team that you had built. And I want to go individually in all three or four of those things. But one more thing before we move on to that: was it difficult to convince external investors about the commerce and finance play, right? And I was reading this in one of your recent interviews, where nothing like this has been attempted across the world, right? No economy is like India, where there are so many SMEs and stuff like that. So there's no model that you can say, hey, we are building the X of India, right? When you went out and actually tried to raise after your initial round from Matrix, what was the response from the investors?
See, to be honest with you, Matrix funding was relatively easy because it was funding of collective resumes, and we had a good set of resumes to begin with, not just the founding team, but also the initial set of joinees in of business. But what happened is, as we hit the ground and as the business scaled, we realized that our solution has to be completely tailored to the Indian market. And as the solution started giving numbers, most people started questioning, saying, hey, which is this Chinese or American equivalent that we can point out to actually understand your business model? And that's typically the first question that a VC or an investor is going to ask you. This is Series B. Series A was relatively easy for us. And Series B, unfortunately, was being raised at a time which was the black winter of VC funding in India, which was the whole of 2016. So I think investing in general was skeptical, but because they could not really find out a equivalent for us which used to exist in the US and China, actually became doubly hard for us. We tried our level best, and I remember in the same interview I said this number, which I actually went back and checked. It was true. We had 73 rejections before we found our 74th lucky charm who got into the investment. Nothing worked at that time. Frankly, we had the numbers. We were very close to profitability. In 2017 early, I think in January or February, we turned profitable. Profitability didn't matter back then. What mattered really is that so Indian a solution, so sales oriented, and really talking about, we are so dhanda oriented that, we almost sounded as if we were not visionary in the beginning, are things that worked against us. But as they say, you just need a lady to marry, one lady to marry. You need one investor to invest in you. You probably need one teacher to change your life, and one God you need to believe in. So that one happened, and we are thankful for that. I'm sure they have enjoyed the journey with us. This was Zodius Technologies, who actually signed with us sometime late of 2016 and finally came in 2017 March. I would say it was Providence. Glad to be associated with them. I hope they hear a part of this podcast and feel good about it.
Yeah. One last thing before we move on to the core sort of unique angles that off business has. Getting into finance, while strategically it made sense because that was fueling B2B commerce, that was the foundation for B2B commerce. But none of the founding team actually had any experience with lending, collections, risk assessment, everything that is core to financial services. Nobody in the founding team had any experience there. Take me through that journey of realizing that I need to go build a fintech or a financial services company, realizing that don't have any skill set, to actually pulling it off and building a unicorn. Like, what was that mental journey that you had to go through?
So I will tell you my first time when I actually thought about building a financial services company. I actually spoke to somebody who was very close to me, and he told me that, hey, you have to first look at the ROA tree. To be honest, I did not know what ROA stood for. Forget the tree that came from it. That is where we started. And when I read up on it, I understood that the ROA tree is the very basic of financing, which is if you're not making money on your assets, which is basically what you have invested in the market, both debt and equity put together, you're not going to make money in the company. So that's where we started. We did not know what ROA was. Credit came naturally to us. At a very colloquial level, we knew that this guy will pay back, this guy will not pay back. But how to really study it out of financial statements did not come naturally to us because we'd never done it. But there is this simple belief that all of us share, and that has been true for our business across its journey, whenever we started to even now, which is whenever we pick up something new, we will not learn by actually hiring that skill from the market. There is enough and more that actually exists in the market. We are going to read up on it. I remember actually promising to myself that what I am going to do right after office hours, and office hours those days were used to be long, and entrepreneur is supposed to be 24/7, to read at least 10 balance sheets a day. In addition to those 10 balance sheets, read up at least one analyst report of either a banking enterprise or a shadow banking company. I took some of that. Somebody like one of my co-founders, Ruchi, actually took up on reading credit policies of other companies. I remember Vasant during that time saying, I will learn about how sales networks are formed in financial services companies. Nitin, who's the juggernaut amongst us, he said, okay, whatever you guys learn, tell me, I'll go and implement it. So we became this, I would say, engine that was trying to learn on the fly. And I will be honest in sharing that I'm very happy we did that, because very basic innovations that we did in terms of creating our credit policies, our product, in terms of how we developed our sales structures, was because we started anew. It seems very, I would say, outlandish right now to say, but the reality is, when you are starting to learn theory, you start questioning very basic things about why, just at a very basic level, why do a credit note of a company, why does it need to run into 70 pages? Can it be done in 7? We ended up creating a 2-pager credit note, which was actually focused on what we thought was actually wrong with the company, right? So we started questioning the basics, spent a long time over it. I think for about 3 to 4 months, all of us used to not only read up, but come back, discuss, implement a few things on the field, and realize 80% of it was wrong. But when we got that 20% right, we really learned from it. It was hard work, it was midnight oil being burned, but it was done the exact right way, in my opinion. And as we see it right now, I think we are seeing early fruits of it.
Yeah, I think the beginner lens definitely helps, right? And when I heard about the products that Off Business was selling in the market, it seemed very intuitive. It was like, oh, why didn't this exist earlier, right? Versus if you get somebody experienced from the industry, they bring the industry products with them, they bring the industry practices with them, and that basically you are a me too at that point in time, rather than truly innovating.
And to be honest with you, Siddharth, we did try Me Too products as well, and we failed in it big time. And we scaled down. As you know, one of our mottos is to actually fail fast. We scaled in it so quickly and so fast that we realized what we were doing from a very first principles level was actually the right way to do it.
Yeah, 100%. Okay, so we spoke about the foundations, the business model for the company. There are some things that are very unique, and you briefly mentioned it in this discussion. Let's start with the incredible sales engine that you've built, right? I've seen it up and close, and I know it works beautifully, but it takes a lot of effort to pull this off. I'll tell you why, right? One, it's a large sales team. It's not something that you're managing 5-10 people. It's hundreds of people across the country, going out of the field and actually selling, right? How do you hire to get the sales team? What's the hiring sort of principle? How do you make them fit into the culture, right? Which is another thing which is very strong at Off Business. The sales culture, or the overall culture, is extremely strong. How did you go about building this sales engine is something that I'm curious about.
Yeah. So first of all, as you rightly pointed out, Siddharth, we have to get the hiring right. And in hiring in organizations that I had spent, namely ITC, McKinsey, and Matrix, I had learned one very simple thing, that it is relatively easier to make people, probably younger minds, learn than to make older minds unlearn. So we said the way we will solve for it is by actually going and hiring freshers or people who are less than 1 years in terms of experience. And everybody in each of our companies, whether it was all the three companies that I named, used to have a management training program. A management training program or assistant manager training program, wherein they used to go to campuses, and in campuses they used to pick up the cream de la cream, pay them well, incentivize them well, tell them that they are going to run businesses and throw them at the deep end of the pool. Now it seems like a very obvious one to do, but it will not see very early fruits, and the temptation to actually do something just the opposite when you are not seeing early fruits is immense. So I think the way we solved it is we in our minds went and hired these freshers, and you would find it tough to believe that our first batch had 8 people, 7 of them are with us, and each of them is either a business unit head, meaning leading a P&L of at least 200 crores per year, or is a CXO in his own right, which means that they are probably leading a function which is almost reporting to the CEO. So you have to be patient. You have to make sure that most of these people are given the opportunity that they can learn, and the fact that they are forgiven for their failures and they learn from their failures. It is very slow. In the first couple of years, it's going to be excruciatingly slow, but that's the model we adopted. And batch by batch by batch by batch, we are today in MT number 6 batch, management trainee number 6 batch. It has really paid, I think it paid dividends from batch number 3 onwards, which is when the first batch had actually spent close to 2 years with us. The beauty of that model is that it has inherent camaraderie built in. The reason being that if Siddharth Betala is from ISB, he always looks up to his senior batch ISB guy and knows that he can always reach out to somebody who can be both a buddy and a mentor and learn from. So there is inherent camaraderie that is built in. It has inherent meritocracy also built in, because when you are joining as a batch, you will relatively, in a healthy way, also fight with your friend who's joined in the same batch and want to outbeat him. So there is inherent brotherhood and inherent meritocracy. So you end up becoming a caring meritocracy. And I think the second one that has really come to fruition right now, and I saw it in the last couple of years, is as we spend, all these guys are rising. And in our company, we have only 5 levels, I being the 5th level. In 4 years, people have actually jumped all levels. So in the 5th year, you have a fully trained set of more than 30 to 40 people who've spent 4 to 5 years in the organization and are jobless. So they drive all these new initiatives. They drive our entries into newer supply chains. They drive our entries of new products that we build either on the financing side or on the commerce side. They drive new geographies. They are the 0 to 1 guys because they know it all. So the fact is, as they rise in the system, they always create space for the guys below them, knowing very well that when the below guys rise, they only rise, right? So that MT program is something that we hired, that we started off with, and that's how we hired, right? The second is how do you really keep them motivated? Motivated, I touched upon earlier, but we'll say that again. I think there is inherent camaraderie. If you are in a batch, 50 people are joining together, freshers from B schools or from select engineering schools, they always feel that they are a part of the same brethren. And when they look around, they see their seniors, either 1 year senior, 2 year senior, whatever it is. And then you foster that camaraderie by making sure that there are small breakout sessions, there are breakout outings wherein they go out with people in their batch or people who are senior to them. And that kind of brings in that, feeling of altruism, brotherhood, camaraderie. I don't know if you remember the ABC of business, which still exists. And then once you ingrain something, even in one link in the batch, you will see that the entire batch, because of either campus across many batches or many campuses within the same batch, it just spreads like wildfire, right? So I think that's what we have done. Close to about 80% of our organization is run by people who are freshers. And this is not true just across sales, but it's sales, ops, credit ops, finance, and that has paid dividends for us. The negative part of doing this is that it needs patience. It needs you to have seen it succeed in other places. But to be very honest, I knew no other model. That's the only model I knew.
Interesting. I think the other thing that I personally saw and realized that was great was you were not going to these tier 1 B schools, right? You were not going to the ISBs to hire freshers. You were not going to the ABCs to hire freshers. One, both from a cost perspective, and the second is they come with some sort of expectation, or I forget the right word, but there's some air to it, right? Like they come from merit, prestigious business schools, versus you said, let's go to these the newer IIMs and try and get people from them and give them that opportunity to succeed and to rise in a startup. What was that a conscious decision? I'm assuming it was a conscious decision. What was the thought process behind it?
So it was conscious and intuitive, to be honest. In my opinion, tier 2 is always the right place to go to, or even tier 3. The reason for that is that these are guys who've actually not gone to tier 1, and hence that hunger of actually becoming tier 1 in their professional as well as prior academic record is something that is burning inside them. They know that they nearly missed in the past, or probably missed in the past, and hence you are inheriting a guy with not just skills but also with tremendous amount of hunger. The second reason I would say that we went to tier 2 schools is, given that we want to be profitable and we wanted to maintain a certain remuneration structure in the company, had we gone with that to tier 1B schools, like let's say Indian School of Business or any of the top IIMs or even the top IITs, we would probably be in the second quartile in terms of the CTCs being offered out there. Whereas if we went to the tier 2 or maybe tier 3B schools, we were always picking up cream de la cream. I think the third thing was this choice of actually selecting B schools rather than I would say engineering schools. The reason for that is that a B school grad typically has done his post grad, so he's not going to move likely. So he's likely joining to retire rather than joining to move on. And because if he's joining to retire and likely within 2 to 3 years he gets married, then we not only inherit his wife into the culture of the company, but also his also looking forward to his progeny, and hence we've kind of tripled, maybe quadrupled, depending on how fertile he wants to be, or fertile she wants to be, in the company itself. So I think it was a conscious choice of saying, let's get people a little later in their professional career, and hence let's get to B schools and tier 2.
Interesting. And then you mix that up, as you said, with meritocracy to really build that sales engine out. But how do you scale culture, right? That's one part of it. Is it's meritocracy. You're for hiding from the same college, there's camaraderie. But how do you scale culture across? You're headquartered in Gurgaon. There's another headquarters in South, but you're placed across different cities, across different states in the country. Scaling culture. What was the thought process behind that?
Yeah. 22 offices and counting, so has got difficult with time, to be honest. But in our minds, there are two ways in which you scale culture. The first way is apprenticeship. So if I am sitting out here as, let's say, the sales team head, I should be having at least 2 people who are clones of me, who in turn will make sure that there are at least a couple of them below who are clones of theirs. So to force apprenticeship in the DNA of leadership is something that we followed since day one. Again, something I learned from my prior vocations at McKinsey, ITC and all that. They used to always say that your job is to teach while doing, right? So hence apprenticeship is something that is ingrained in life at our business. I would say the second way of scaling culture is to be very conscious about it. You should know that unless you do something periodically, and that period has to be really, really quick, like let's say once in a month, you should know that the culture will break. You cannot take it for granted that what you sowed as seeds in the past will actually keep growing, because there will always be weeds, there will always be some insects, some pests who will come and eat your crop. So sowing of the seeds is actually apprenticeship, but making sure that you do something or the other, some injection or the other, whether it is pesticide, insecticide, the herbicide, it has to be sprayed periodically. It's like a crop just growing, right? And that is something that we consciously do. Let's say it's a state, let's say it's a Mumbai office. We know that if we don't do every month some kind of an outing, some kind of a senior visit, some kind of a motivation exercise, we know that it will break. If every week we do not celebrate at least one guy from Mumbai, and Mumbai is a large office for us, it has close to about 60 people today. If we don't celebrate company-wide at least one guy, you would remember this clutch of emails that used to come saying, hey, this guy's done great work, and then like 200 people will reply saying, hey, great work, great work, great work, great work. And if you don't do that once a week, for each and every office, almost consciously, it's going to break. So I think a combination of apprenticeship combined with the fact that there has to be serious injections of motivation within the team is what keeps it going.
Makes sense. Uh, let's come to the you briefly mentioned it, the dhanda culture that off business started off with, right? You said everything that you evaluated at least had to be profitable at a transaction level, and in the ecosystem that you sort of raised money in, and the peers that you were comparing yourself to, the other tech startups or other kind of startups, profitability was not something people worried about. For you to have that conviction that this is how I'm going to do it, and obviously take some hard choices along the way, right? Because when you focus so much on profitability, you have to take some hard choices in terms of growth, in terms of other aspects. What was that journey like to first become profitable in 2017 and then becoming a unicorn while being profitable, which is very, very rare?
To be honest, it sounds like a very hard thing to do, but if you look at businesses that are being run in India, and startups being just a part of it, you would see that probably a bulk of them, maybe I'll put a number to it, greater than 90% of them are actually profitable. So in my opinion, it is quite normal to think that you want to build a business profitably. And it is quite abnormal to think that you will sacrifice that very basic thing for scale. In my opinion, profitability is such a simple thing that if you don't do it from the very beginning, it is very difficult to get it later in your journey because it becomes a part of your DNA, right? With those two thoughts, that it is normal to be profitable, abnormal to be loss making, and the second, that we have to do it in the initial stage itself, and later it's going to be very, very tough, is what I knew even before starting. And this is not something that I knew, but because most of the early team members at Off Business, founding team as well as initial guys included, they all, because they were from trading entities or retail entities or had seen business in the past, this was almost definitely ingrained in them somewhere. I think it is just the fact that, while we had these temptations of saying that, hey, why don't we do it unprofitably, and we turned a blind eye to it. We were never really in the limelight per se, at least till we turned unicorn. Nobody really paid attention to it. It's like saying you're like a sage or a hermit deep in meditation, and there is this apsara that is dancing next to you, saying, "Why don't you open your eyes?" and that's elope. That's some temptation we didn't fall for. We remained focused because, to be honest, that's the only way you can create a business. I mean, if you are not profitable after some years in the journey, let's say 2 to 3 years in the journey, in India you just can't bend it. I think globally it's still profitable, because globally no businesses actually lose money at a gross margin level. In India, people lose money even at a gross margin level, right? So I think it was very normal. And to be very honest, right now it seems as if it's being celebrated a lot. I don't think it is something that we put effort towards. What we did put effort towards is to say that, hey, if the lure is to the contrary, we will have our disciplined eyes not going to look that way.
Makes sense. One aspect in this whole thing, why to remain profitable, is the frugality angle, the dhanda culture, right? Like evaluating everything that you do with that lens of, is this actually adding value and creating value? And one of the things that Off Business has done really well is started out new business units, new businesses altogether under that big umbrella of OFB. Be it the commerce play, be it the software play, the financing play, within commerce, multiple product lines starting from scale, right? So you've kept increasing either in terms of regions or product lines or products. What is that thought process where you realize, okay, it's time to do something new? And if we do something new, here are the various things that we look at and say, if it's successful, we scale it. If it fails, we close it. What has that journey been like in terms of building that empire of sorts? And it's also very counter to what the general startup gyan there is focus. Do just one thing and just go deep into it. How do you react to that?
I think there is no trade-off to be made in between depth and width. You have to do both. Because the moment you have just one and start going in depth in it and not do the width, what is going to happen is somebody is going to come after your enterprise and take away what you've built. So to stay ahead in the curve, what you have to make sure that at every point in time you are adding newer and newer features, newer and newer products, both financial and commercial, newer and newer teams, newer and newer geographies, so that you always stay ahead of the curve while building depth. Both, if there is no choice to be had, because to be like, to give you an example, today in steel we do close to about 300 crores a month, 300 crores a month, right? It's still at that scale grows by close to about 8 to 9% month on month, and this has been through the COVID period. Okay, which means that in a year it almost becomes 1.4 times, and there is no choice. While we have built petrochemicals, other ferrous materials, we have built industrial chemicals, we built food grains, we built food processing, we built cement, aggregates, other building materials, but still we have to grow in steel. So what do you need? If you can't do a trade-off, typically people do a trade-off because they have limited resources, and typical resources are either capital or is bandwidth of management. So if you can make sure that you have a lot more bandwidth by actually making more leaders in the system, by actually making sure that people are growing in the system, that they can actually do both older and newer things, you can solve that. By doing what we did in terms of hiring, which we alluded to sometime in the past, we have actually created a lot of new leaders in the system. So if you remember, what I was saying is, every year 30 to 40 people become jobless because they are 4 years old in the system, they start doing new things. But the guys who rise are going to do the in-depth things. So one, you solve for bandwidth by actually making more leaders grow within the company. The second way is to actually solve for capital. If you're always dependent on equity capital, what is going to happen is that someday it will come, someday it will not, and hence there is a scarcity of resource. The way you solve it is you actually bring in another form of capital, and you could probably bring in two forms of capital. One is obviously your own retained earnings or profits, which can lead to growth, but also debt as a capital. Now, if debt, like for example in our financial services play, we are close to 3:1 in terms of leverage. Debt can far outstrip equity at any point in time in terms of growing a business. Like for example, today we have raised close to about $350 million, but we raised debt in excess of $900 million. It's almost 3 times. So by bringing in debt, what you can do is that you can actually exponentially increase your capital base so that you can do both depth and width. But how do you bring debt? That requires you to be profitable again. It requires you to actually demonstrate processes. It requires you to actually build a team of leaders that people are ready to back on. So it's a virtuous cycle, right? And if you solve for both capital and bandwidth, you don't need to make a choice. You can do both.
Interesting. This whole angle of processes and technology, when I interviewed there, one of the things that I really liked was you called yourself a tech-enabled organization, right? You were not going after the tech startup hype that everybody was going after. As you said, you were laying pretty low till you sort of achieved unicorn status. Even after that, by the way, I've seen some unicorns without being profitable, they become unicorn and they're all over the news. There's so much PR, there's so much all of that. You've not believed in any of that. You've not paid marketing dollars for any of your products and services. But tech-enabled versus tech-led. What do you think is the difference between the two kind of companies?
Yeah, I think it's a difference in mindset. In my opinion, people who are tech-led, who claim to be are tech-led, are of two types. One is they are genuinely tech-led. Like Google is a tech-led organization. They can be incorporated and be run out of anywhere in the world. It really doesn't matter. The others are doing it because they want to add vanity metrics around it, either to attract people or to attract investors or to build a glamour around their business. So in my mind, tech-led is when you are genuinely tech-led and you build a tech product which actually stands on its own and can deliver profitability, growth and quality of the business, all three things together without really a human element to it. Quality is like, in my opinion, even Google and Facebook are not completely tech-led because they do have sales teams, right, which go and visit corporates for their ad services, but they're largely tech-led. In my opinion, if you need to have a backbone of operations, sales or human element to complement your tech outreach, is when you become a tech-enabled organization. When you realize in your head that, hey, we have not reached that level of maturity, that we can actually deliver quality, profitability and growth together with just tech is when you are a tech-enabled enterprise. In our view, what we do, which is commerce, especially large transaction, large volume, supply chain commerce, and financing, our services, if you are tech first there, then you are literally going to lose all your clothes out there. They have to be complemented with offline services because it is like a doctor diagnosing the problem. You can have a machine telling him what the test reports are, but the diagnosis has to be made by the doctor, and that I'm talking about underwriting right now. It has to be there has to be a human element to it. There will be a day when machines will take over, but the day is far, far away. And understanding and appreciation of that is important. And in our view, we are in a business which is predominantly tech enabled, and by taking that view we actually say, hey, technology can be used either for acquisition, or can be used for efficiency, or can be used for control. And acquisition is marketing, control is stability in processes, efficiency is when you cut down your cost. That's how we think about technology. We do not want to add a vanity matrix, because we believe that vanity matrix like valuation, hiring, glamour around a business are supposed to be attributed to the company's success, which is a combination of only three things. One, the scale that you achieve. Two, the profitability that you achieve and growth around the same. And three, the quality of growth. This is going to stand the test of time. Just putting a layer of technology to and talking about it is something that we have figured in our journey is not really helpful for us.
Yeah, I think that mindset of being tech enabled, what it also does is you're able to be rational in terms of the spends that you do on technology, right? When you think of yourself as tech led, you sort of fool yourself into believing that I need to invest in technology today, and hopefully I will, get the returns 2 3 years 4 years down the line. What that leads to is, multiple tech products that are probably not needed, overspending on hiring the best of the engineers and stuff like that, which most of these organizations, if you're not tech led, shouldn't be done. You should focus on profitability instead. You've been in a unique position of working with the SME ecosystem of India, and on this podcast we've spoken to multiple SMEs. Also, we've also spoken about the state of the SME ecosystem in India. I want to understand from you, you know, two or three black swan events in the last 4 or 5 years, right? Demonetization changed how people operated their books, right? That was a big watershed moment. Then GST happened, which sort of accentuated that in terms of processing things. And then COVID happened. Two black swan events, one regulatory change. The SME ecosystem in India has gone through a lot. What do you think is ahead of them now? What do you think an SME needs to do in order to survive and thrive in the new sort of world over the next decade?
Yeah, you missed one more black swan event, which was the credit squeezing because of severe ILFS and India bulls and all those defaults happening. SMEs actually bore the brunt of the credit squeezing that happened from both banks and NBFCs. So in my opinion, it is a clear story of survival of the fittest. I think what we saw in the last 4 5 years was sudden shocks being put on the system. I think the bottom 10, maybe the bottom 20% have got wiped out. I would say the next 30 to 40% from the bottom are actually challenged for survival. But the top 50% or maybe the top 60% have actually great years ahead of them. The reason being, first of all, those bottom 40 or 50% have got wiped out, so there is less competition. But more than that, there are three mega trends that I see from my vantage point as a grounded sales guy, almost vividly in front of my eyes. The three mega changes that are happening are the following. The first is that in the core sectors of the economy, infrastructure, capital goods, heavy machinery, consumer durables, and stuff like that, a lot of this demand used to go away from India, even for domestic consumption, to countries in either Southeast Asia, China, or the lower cost destinations, particularly for raw material. And the import demand never really used to come to India. Right now, both of them have folded up in India, and because it could be import substitution, it could be that there is a global sentiment that is in favor of India, but this massive tailwind that has come in, most SMEs who are actually managing their P&Ls to say, hey, let me just stay above water so that I can breathe, now are thinking about raise more money in their balance sheet, largely through debt. right? So that's one mega trend that is shaping the ecosystem. The second mega trend that is shaping the ecosystem is that if you ask anybody who's been around on the streets, all the household items like the kitchen items, the toys, the things like furniture and any other household ware like electrical items, appliances, and all that used to be largely imported and dumped into India. Again, because of what has happened in the last 3 to 4 years, anti-dumping laws, demonetization, money laundering is not possible right now. COVID shut off the logistics corridors and stuff like that. What has happened is that even this particular layer of the fat middle class of India has actually moved to SMEs. Like if you go to the Palika Bazaar of Delhi or you go to Gafar Market, you will see that they are Indian goods. They're being made by SMEs after probably a decade, maybe a decade and a half, right? The third mega trend that is happening is that the acceptance of new age solutions, like the one which we offer, is a 5-year-old solution. There are many other new age solutions which have got wider acceptance right now. They are fundamentally cheaper, they are fundamentally more efficient, they are fundamentally better for the SME ecosystem. Is the acceptance of this is actually going through the roof, largely because of the fact that if you reflect on what has happened in the last 12 to 18 months, all the good news have been about these players. They probably breaking new barriers in terms of scale, some of them turning profitable, some of them raising a lot of money, they being talked about in the press and stuff like that. So the new age acceptance, or there was a resistance to change, and that is going away, and hence the new age acceptance is very high. So in my opinion, these three demand tailwinds combined with the fact that the bottom 40 to 50% has been wiped off is going to create a massive wave of growth for the people who survived after the battle of survival of the fittest. And what we are going to see is the dawn of new Indian economy, particularly for these SMEs. And I can actually tell you that from our borrower and customer profile, close to 70 to 80% of our people have themselves come in and applied for enhancements. And that number is almost 10x what it used to be about a year and a half to 2 years back. They themselves coming and saying, "Sir, I'm growing. Please give me capital for growth." Right? So that's my opinion. I know it's a little bit to the extreme, but that's what I see on the streets.
Just to add on to that, I think the government regulations are also favoring the SMEs, right? In terms of the PLIs that are coming in terms of the various other things that the government is doing to prevent anti-dumping, to increase import duties on certain products. All of that, as you said, goes back to the Indian SMEs, and they stand to benefit out of it.
Yes, I think
Yeah.
given the fact that SMEs in India today account for more than 45% of the employment, and the fact is that they are responsible for the first level of value add almost in every product or service that is delivered to the economy per se, their health, growth, and profitability is as important to them as it is to the both of us talking on this call. So
Yeah.
it is good that it is happening. After every dark night, there is a dawn, and we are likely staring at the dawn.
Okay, we're going to close it out in the next 5-10 minutes. I want to understand. Raised $160 million from SoftBank right now. You're profitable. What's the future of business? What business lines are you looking at? Where's the depth? Where's the width? What's the next 3 to 5 year plan now?
Yeah, so I think we on the depth side we want to continue doing what we were doing, which is a combination of three things: making sure that we add a lot more new SKUs within the supply chains that we picked up. It would be interesting for you to note that while we are in 9 supply chains today, we only have 30 odd SKUs. So we want to make sure that we are in all the dominant SKUs of the supply chains that we are there. The second thing around depth is to make sure that we actually increase our financing penetration both across geographies as well as the supply chains that we are in. Our financing is probably 25 to 30% relevant in terms of transactions that we do today. We want to take it up. The third thing that we want to do is to make sure that all the financing and the commerce is actually relevant for Pan India. So if we have a SKU in NCR, it should be available across all the clusters that we are present in. So that for me is depth, which is about making sure that we do what we are doing right and making sure that we do more of what we do. The width comes from the fact that we want to now go backward in the chain. What we do today is in raw materials, we are merely an aggregation engine. selling labels or selling brands of other agencies or other enterprises who actually trade on the market. Now we want to make sure that those brands are our own. Today we have private labels of less than 1%. We want to take that to, let's say, a healthy 10 to 15%. We want to make sure that we acquire some of the people who actually have licenses that gives us proprietary access to channels wherein today we cannot sell because we do not have the vintage. Third, we want to make sure that we get into contract manufacturing. By getting into contract manufacturing, again for raw materials, backward integration in our chains, what we can make sure is that we eat a little bit of the manufacturing margin while also benefiting the ecosystem in terms of saying, hey, there is promise of both assured buying at right quality of receivables and rates. So that's the width part of the solution. So depth and width is what we are going to aim for in the years to come.
Basically, I think getting your hands dirtier in terms of like actually producing some of these goods, investing in some of these SMEs, even acquiring some of these companies, as you said.
Yeah, in my mind, Siddharth, if you take the core sectors of the Indian economy, there are four pillars of it. The first is sourcing, which is for agri will be the fields, for things that are under the earth will be the mines, it will be under the seas for oil. So that's sourcing. Then you have manufacturing, which is when you take out from sourcing and you do one level of value add. And then you have trading or aggregation, because somebody has to make sure that he actually takes in the material from the manufacturer and delivers it to the end user. And fourth is financing. So sourcing, manufacturing, trading and financing are the four fundamental pillars of how core sectors are built. Today, if you look at what we do, we are in the last two. The reason we started off with the last two is because it was relatively simpler to build, it was relatively healthier to build, and with lower cost, you could actually understand the market structures a lot better. As we scale, we are going backward into saying, hey, now let's deep dive into manufacturing without really owning the assets. And there is a lot of unutilized capacity in India. And as we go backward, we will also dabble into a little bit of sourcing without really owning the assets. The wrapper on this is when you have completed sourcing, manufacturing, trading, and financing, is when you create a brand. When you put the brand in the beginning, or you put the marketing in the beginning, is when you create an unhealthy enterprise. So we believe as we strike out all these four pillars one by one, we would have made a brand of business synonymous with the core sectors of the economy.
Yeah, for people who don't know what off business stands for, off business was order for business and order from business. That's where the OF in the business comes from. And you know, as time goes by, you're truly making it happen across the value chain, order for business and order from business. A couple of personal questions before we close it out, Ashish. One, right when you were starting 2016 is when you had your daughter, right? Both you and Ruchi, who's your better half, are part of the organization. You both co-founded this and built it. You basically, you know, had two babies over the last 4-5 years and grown them both. As an entrepreneur, how do you think about that work-life balance? Because obviously a young child needs all the attention, support, all of that. How have you balanced those two things out?
There was no choice again. We had to balance it. We made sure that we, at least Ruchi and I made sure that before we started, we had the support of our extended family who could take care of anything that was not related to our business. And to be honest, this story has been spoken about a lot, but if you look at the initial founding team members, all of them got married here. Most of them had their first or maybe their second kid out here. Vasant married here, for instance. Bhuvan had his second kid, for instance. And stuff like that. All of them actually face this challenge. Whether you are starting up or you are well within your startup journey, once you have this significant break in your personal life, you have to again start looking for support systems that can actually take care of that. We were lucky to have people who were very very dedicated to us. They were committed to the cause of saying, okay, as these two people go out and do their work, let us be their playback singers or their backbone of support, both in office as well as on the personal front. And it is kudos to people in off business and people who don't know our extended family who actually lent a hand for that. And that is true for almost everybody at our business. I remember somebody telling me a stat that we've had 100 babies out here in our business, right? And that those 100 babies, I'm sure all their fathers or mothers in question who were at our business had the exact same issue, but they continue to grow strong.
Makes sense. Makes sense. Okay, one last question, and this is I'm excited to hear your answer to this. You come from humble beginnings, right? Odisha, very middle class sort of upbringing. How have you thought about money? Right, you hit money when you got out of IIT Kharagpur in terms of getting an ITC job and then working at McKinsey and Matrix. So you'd started earning a decent amount of money, and then through entrepreneurship you've created some wealth. How has your sort of thought process towards money evolved or changed, and what is it now?
So I remember very early in my life, one of my teachers telling me that money is a way of keeping score, and that philosophy is something that I have ingrained in myself completely. I think it's a very objective way of keeping score of how well you've done in life. So I'm not a spendthrift. I do not have a lavish lifestyle. I do not even intend to have one. I believe whatever I have is more than enough for at least for my generations to come, even now. So the reality is, if you believe that money is a way of keeping score, you tend to do things right, acting right by people who helped you make that money, which is about distributing that money to make sure that it grows even further. To make sure that and this is personal stuff I'm talking about. I'll come back to professional. On the personal side, also making sure that the money is invested in the right things, which actually builds not just for yourself but for your ecosystem, both personal and professional. So that's how I think about money from personal side. But on professional side, it's absolutely different. My entire currency of thinking is money. I know that we are in the business of where actually the raw material is money, our output is money, our costs are money, our revenue is money. So on the professional side, for me, money is everything. So to save a penny is much easier than actually earning that penny. So on the professional side, it is I'm obsessed about it. I think that that's the only way in which you can run a business, both in terms of quality, growth, and profitability. And that is something that everybody has to learn at some point in time uh, in their own professional journeys. So, very different ways of looking at money from both personal and professional standpoints. And I'm sure everybody has a similar kind of lens to the same.
Yeah, I love that philosophy of money is a way to keep score. Perfect. Ashish, thank you so much. Thank you so much for taking the time out and being so candid with your entire journey of building off business and the various businesses that you've built. As I said, I've had the privilege of seeing you operate closely. I've seen the organization operate closely, and every time I speak to someone, before you guys turned unicorn, I told people this is inevitable, right? This company is going to make it big. This company is going to be a unicorn. Not a lot of people know about our business, thanks to no marketing spend, no PR, keeping a very low light. So I'm hoping this episode will give people a glimpse of how you've built this empire.
First of all, thank you for having me. Second of all, you were a big part in making us a unicorn. We have this tag again, which I'll repeat, which is once an OAPN, forever one. And I hope this message reaches almost every OAPN, whether in it or outside it. And we'll all be glad in our hearts if it does.